Imagine standing in the doorway of a house your late wife sketched in a notebook she kept on her nightstand. A house you paid for with 10 years of silence and hands that never stopped working, and watching your own daughter step out of a beat-up sedan with a rehearsed smile and say the words that turned your blood to ice. "Dad, we are moving in." What she did not know was that I had been waiting for this exact moment for a very long time. My name is Harold Dawson. Though most people who know me well have always called me Harry, I am 65 years old, and for the better part of 4 decades, I have worked with my hands, tuning pianos, restoring broken instruments, and finding a quiet dignity in the kind of craft that most of the modern world decided long ago was not worth the trouble. That is who I am. That is who I have always been. The morning it all came to a head was a Sunday in November. I was sitting in the rocking chair on the front porch of my Victorian house, the one with the white columns and the tall windows and the magnolia tree in the front yard, whose branches had grown wide enough to throw shade across half the walkway. The house sat on a gentle hill on the outskirts of Savannah, Georgia. And from the porch, you could see the marshlands stretching out below, still wrapped in a thin morning mist that made everything look like something pulled from a painting you would hang above a fireplace and never get tired of looking at. I had a cup of coffee going cold on the porch rail beside me. The air smelled the way November air smells in the low country, damp and green and carrying the faintest memory of salt from the coast. A mockingbird was working through its catalog somewhere in the magnolia, cycling through stolen melodies with the confidence of a performer who has never once doubted his material. I had earned this porch. I had earned every inch of this view, every board beneath my feet, every coat of paint. 10 years of earning it. Starting from nothing. Starting from the kind of empty that gets into your chest and makes it hard to remember who you were before the silence began. Around my neck, on a thin silver chain tucked beneath my collar, hung a broken piano key. It had been there for 10 years. The story of how it got there is the story I am about to tell you. But first you need to understand what happened on this porch on this particular Sunday morning. I had been sitting there for about 40 minutes when I heard the sound of tires on the gravel at the end of the drive. I did not look up right away, but something made me set my coffee down. Something in the particular rhythm of that engine. Or maybe something older than sound. Some instinct built up over 65 years of living told me to pay attention. The car was a silver sedan, older model. One of the rear panels slightly dented. The kind of car that has been kept running out of necessity rather than affection. It sat at the end of my driveway for a long moment without anyone getting out. The engine cut off. Silence settled back over the yard like a held breath. Then the doors opened. The first person out was a woman with short hair and a bright practiced smile that arrived on her face the way a mask arrives. All at once and fully formed. She looked at the house before she looked at me, and I watched her eyes move across the columns and the windows and the porch furniture with the particular quality of someone who is calculating value rather than appreciating beauty. Behind her came a man with his shoulders already curled inward, his hands deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed somewhere around the middle distance between himself and the ground. He looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped trying to set it down. And last, standing beside the rear door as though he was still deciding whether to step forward, was a young man of about 17 with dark hair and his grandmother's long fingers and an expression on his face that I could not read from where I sat. Something between recognition and a grief he had not yet found the words for. 10 years. They had not called. They had not written. They had not sent so much as a single word in 10 years. And now here they were. Standing at the end of my driveway on a Sunday morning in a car that had seen better days and better decisions. The woman started walking toward my porch steps like she already knew the way. She looked up at the house, the way people look at things they intend to claim. Then she looked at me and her smile went wider, and she said the words I will never forget for as long as I live. "Dad, you have done so well for yourself. This place is gorgeous. We thought we could stay for a while. Family should be together, right?" She said it in one connected flow. The way you say something you have rehearsed enough times that the seams between the pieces have become invisible, as if 10 years of silence had been nothing more than a long vacation, and now she was back. And she expected the door to be open and the past to have folded itself away somewhere. It would not inconvenience anyone. I stood up from my rocking chair without hurrying. I took out 3 bottles of cold water from the cooler I kept on the porch and held them out toward my visitors. I said it was warm for November, and they should stay hydrated. I said it pleasantly, and I meant the pleasantness. And I did not move toward the front door, and I did not open it, and I did not invite anyone inside. What they did not know, what they could not have imagined, was that while they had been busy writing me off, I had been quietly building something they would never be able to touch. And what unfolded on that porch, the secrets dragged into daylight, the recordings kept for a decade, the letter sealed and waiting for exactly this moment, and the legal trap already closed around them, will leave you stunned from beginning to end. Stay with me. Because this story does not just deliver justice, it delivers something far more powerful. I want to tell you about the last morning they came to my door. Not this morning. The one 10 years ago that started all of this. The one I have turned over in my mind so many times it has worn smooth like a stone carried too long in a coat pocket. Because before you can understand what it meant to see Christine walking up my porch steps with that bright, calculating smile, you need to feel the full weight of what that Tuesday cost me. It was an ordinary Tuesday on Birch Lane in Asheville. The kind of morning that gives you no warning of what it is about to become. I had been awake since before sunrise, the way I always was in those days, because sleep had become something that happened to other people in the 2 years since Margaret passed. She had been taken by ALS in the slow and merciless way that disease takes people, stealing first her hands, then her voice, then everything else, while leaving her mind sharp enough to understand exactly what was being lost. I was still moving through every day with the particular heaviness that comes from losing the person who made the whole world make sense. I had a pot of coffee going and the radio on low. One of those old AM stations that plays standards from the 40s and 50s, and I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the light come up over the neighbor's fence, when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps, clean and deliberate. The kind of knock that is not asking permission. I knew before I opened the door that something was wrong. 30 years of being a father teaches you to read knuckles on wood. Those 3 raps said, "This is not a visit. This is an announcement." Victor was standing in front of Christine when I opened the door, which told me everything about the conversation they had already finished in the car on the way over. My daughter was positioned slightly behind her husband, her hands clasped in front of her the way people hold themselves when they have already agreed to something they are not proud of. Her eyes were doing that thing they did when she had already surrendered something, when the argument was over before it reached me. Little Ethan was pressed against his mother's side. He was 7 years old, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and his grandmother's long fingers wrapped around the hem of Christine's jacket. His eyes moved back and forth between his parents and me, with the careful watchfulness of a child who has learned that adult conversations sometimes end with someone crying. Victor did not say good morning. He did not call me Dad, which he had done selectively in better years when he needed something or wanted to appear generous in front of company. He said Harold. Just that. My full first name, stripped of everything familiar. The way you address a stranger you need something formal from. He said that he and Christine had made a decision as a family. The way he said the word family carried a door in it. And I was on the outside of that door, and it was already closing. He said they had decided it would be best if I no longer had contact with them or with Ethan. He said I was too old-fashioned, that my lifestyle was not the influence they wanted around their son, that my circumstances were not what they needed for Ethan to have the kind of life he deserved. Each sentence came out measured, and even like he had timed them, like he knew exactly how many words it would take to dismantle 20-something years and had practiced getting it done efficiently. I looked past him at Christine. I wanted her to tell me this was not what it appeared to be. I wanted her to find whatever was left of her own voice and use it. She looked at the ground. I said her name. I said, "Sweetheart." She looked up once, briefly, And what I saw in her face was not anger and not indifference, but something worse than either of those things. It was the look of a woman who has already made her peace with a choice she knows is wrong and has decided that the shame of it is the price she is willing to pay. Then Victor said the second thing, the thing that turned my knees to water. He said the house was in Margaret's name when she passed. He said it had transferred to Christine. He said they had consulted a lawyer. He said they would need me out by the end of the week, and they were changing the locks this morning. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a new lock set. His hands were steady, which somehow made it worse than if they had been shaking. He walked past me without asking permission and knelt down at my own front door with a screwdriver and began to take apart the lock I had turned every day for years. The sound of metal on metal filled the space where words should have been. I said his name. I said, "Victor, please do not do this." He did not look up. He did not pause. Christine stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and her jaw set and her eyes looking at something past me, past the house, past everything that was happening in front of her, as though she could will herself into some other version of this morning where none of it was real. I do not know how long I stood there watching. Long enough that Ethan had grown restless and fidgety at his mother's side. And then the boy did something that I have carried with me every single day of the 10 years since. When Christine turned away to watch Victor finish with the lock, Ethan reached into the front pocket of his small jacket and pressed something into my hand. It was a piano key, broken off at the base, chipped along one edge. The ivory yellowed with age. It had come from the old upright in the living room, the one Margaret used to play on Sunday evenings while I sat beside her and listened and believed that nothing in the world would ever need to be different from exactly what it was in that moment. His tiny fingers squeezed mine. He looked up at me with those dark eyes that were so much like his grandmother's and whispered so softly I had to bend down to hear it. "Keep playing, Grandpa." Then Christine took him by the hand and pulled him toward the car and said, "Say goodbye to Grandpa. Ethan, you will not be seeing him anymore." I watched the car back out of the driveway. I watched Ethan press his small face against the rear window and keep his eyes on me until the car turned the corner and disappeared. I stood on that porch holding a broken piano key until the street was completely quiet again. And when it was, I looked down at my own front door with its new lock that I did not have the key to. And I understood that my daughter had not just changed a lock. She had closed a door on everything I thought I knew about who I was to the people I loved most. I found a room 3 blocks from that house on Birch Lane, which felt like the right kind of distance at the time. Close enough that I could not entirely pretend the previous chapter of my life had happened somewhere else. Far enough that I did not have to drive past the new lock on my own front door every morning. The room was above a laundromat called Suds and Son that had been washing other people's clothes since before I was born. It had been a storage space before someone put up a few sheets of drywall and called it an apartment. The kitchenette was the size of a coat closet. The bathroom was so narrow I had to turn sideways to dry off after a shower. The single main room served as bedroom and living room and workspace all at once, which meant that the smell of detergent drifting up from below mixed permanently with the linseed oil I used on piano wood until the two became one indistinguishable scent that was neither clean laundry nor honest work, but something in between that I have never been able to smell since without my chest going tight. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this often and with great conviction. 10 years later, I was still telling myself the same thing, and the room was still there, and so was I. The first months were the hardest in ways I did not fully understand until they were behind me. I would wake before dawn and lie in the dark listening to the washing machines cycle through their rhythms below me. That low mechanical hum that became the heartbeat of my solitude, and I would try to locate myself inside my own life. Try to find some solid ground to stand on where there was only the particular silence of a man who has had everything familiar taken from him all at once. I kept the radio on most of the time for the company of other voices. I drank too much coffee and not enough of anything else. I waited for the phone to ring in a way that was less about expecting it to ring and more about needing to believe that it still could. It never did. Not from Christine. Not once in 10 years. What saved me, in the way that ordinary things save people, was work. There was a Baptist church on the corner of Elm and Fourth, a small brick building with stained glass windows that threw colored light across the sanctuary on Sunday mornings, and their piano had not been properly tuned in longer than anyone in the congregation could remember. The pastor's wife heard from someone at the laundromat that the quiet man upstairs used to work on pianos, and she left a note under my door one Tuesday afternoon, written on the back of a church bulletin. I tuned that piano on a Wednesday evening after the building had gone quiet. And when I pressed the keys afterward and heard the instrument answer back the way it was supposed to, clean and true and in conversation with itself, something in my chest unclenched for the first time in months. My hands remembered what they were for. They remembered that they had a purpose beyond holding a coffee cup in the dark and waiting for a phone that was never going to ring. Word moved through the neighborhood the way it always does, in places where people have been living side by side long enough to notice when something changes. A retired music teacher at the senior center needed her spinet restrung. A funeral home on Patton Avenue had a baby grand that had gone badly out of tune and was embarrassing the organist. A woman 3 streets over had inherited her mother's upright and wanted it restored to playable condition before her own daughter's first recital. I said yes to all of it. The pay was modest and the jobs were small, but they kept my hands occupied, and I had learned long before then that occupied hands are a mercy when the mind is working against you. Dolores Vega lived in the apartment building next door. On the second floor, in a unit she had occupied for 19 years, with the settled permanence of someone who had decided this was where she belonged and saw no reason to revisit the question. She was 74 years old, retired after 35 years teaching music at a public middle school, the kind of woman whose presence in a room made the room feel like it had better posture. She had silver hair she kept short and practical, reading glasses that lived on a beaded chain around her neck, and a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who has spent 3.5 decades managing rooms full of 13-year-olds and has never once needed to shout to be heard. She appeared at my door on a Saturday morning about 2 months after I moved in, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the diner up the block and a loaf of banana bread wrapped in foil that she had baked at 5 in the morning because, as she explained without being asked, she did not sleep well either, and preferred to be useful about it, rather than philosophical. We sat on the concrete steps outside the building and drank our coffee and watched the neighborhood come awake. And she did not ask me what had happened or why I was living above a laundromat or where my family was. She simply sat beside me and let the silence be what it was, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for me and longer than I wanted to admit. That Saturday became every Saturday. Coffee from the diner, banana bread when she felt like baking, the concrete steps, and the slow accumulation of trust that happens between people who have both lived long enough to know that the things worth having rarely arrive on schedule. About 3 years in, on one of those Saturday mornings when the grief was sitting particularly close to the surface, she looked over at me with those steady teacher's eyes and said something I have carried with me ever since. She said, "The world did not break you, Harry. It just has not caught up to what you are worth yet." I was not sure I believed her, but I held on to those words, the way you hold on to a melody in the dark, not because you are certain it will carry you, but because it is there, and your heart needs something to follow. I had kept my old post office box. I cannot tell you exactly why, except that it felt like the last thread connecting me to the life I had before the Tuesday they came to my door with a new lock and a speech that had been rehearsed in the car. The box was at the main post office on Haywood Road, a small brass door with a combination I had memorized so many years ago that my fingers turned the dial without consulting my mind, the way a pianist's hands find the keys of a song they have played 1,000 times. About a year after the silence began, something strange started happening. Every so often, with no pattern I could predict, a plain white envelope would appear in that box. No return address, no name. Inside would be cash folded small. $20 sometimes, occasionally 10, once 50. No note, no explanation. Just money, placed inside paper, placed inside my box, by a hand I could not identify. I never spent a single dollar of it. Instead, I went to a garage sale 3 streets over from the laundromat on a Saturday afternoon when the autumn light was coming in low through the trees, and I bought a small wooden box made of cedar for $2. That evening I sat at my workbench with a fine chisel and carved 2 words into the lid in careful block letters. For Ethan. Every envelope went inside it, untouched, in the order it arrived. I did not know where the money was coming from. I told myself it did not matter. What mattered was keeping it against the possibility of a day I could not yet see clearly from where I was standing. Every September I knew which Saturday was Ethan's birthday. I knew because I had stood behind the magnolia tree across the street from Christine and Victor's house every single year, watching the balloons tied to the mailbox, hearing the children laugh through the open windows, watching my grandson grow taller with every passing September. The magnolia was old and wide enough to hide a man who did not want to be seen, and its branches hung low with the heavy patience of a tree that has been standing in one place long enough to have witnessed more than anyone has thought to ask it about. The first year he turned 8, I could still see the boy I remembered, small and dark-haired and quick. By 10, he had grown into his limbs the way colts do, all knees and elbows and sudden bursts of speed across the yard. By 12, his face had begun to find the shape it would carry into adulthood, and I could see Margaret in the line of his jaw, and the way he held his head slightly to one side when he was listening to something that interested him, the same way she used to tilt her head when a piece of music caught her attention. I never stayed long enough for anyone to notice the old man standing at the edge of the property behind a tree. I only stayed long enough to see that he was alive, and growing, and still in the world. Then I turned and walked back to my room above the laundromat. Alone, carrying whatever version of him I had collected that year, like a photograph I would study in the months between visits. But there was one September that cut different from the others. Ethan was 13, and the party had wound down, and most of the other children had gone home. I was about to leave when the front door opened, and Ethan came out onto the porch carrying a small electronic keyboard under his arm. He sat on the top step and set it across his knees and began to play something, and even from across the street, I could hear that whatever he was doing with that instrument was not the random noise of a child pressing buttons. There was structure to it. There was intention. His fingers moved with a certainty that I recognized in my bones because I had spent 40 years watching hands find their way across keys, and I knew the difference between someone who was playing at music and someone who was playing music. Then the front door opened again and Victor came out. I could not hear the words clearly from where I stood, but I did not need to. His body said everything his voice was saying. He stood over the boy with his shoulders squared and his finger pointing down at the keyboard, and his posture carrying the particular rigidity of a man who has decided that something is beneath him and intends to make certain his son understands that it is beneath both of them. Victor said something sharp and short. Ethan's hands went still on the keys. Then Victor reached down and took the keyboard from the boy's lap and carried it inside. And the door closed behind him, and Ethan sat alone on the porch steps with his empty hands resting on his knees and his head bowed in the particular posture of a child who has just been told that the thing he loves is not worth loving. I gripped the trunk of the magnolia tree so hard the bark pressed patterns into my palm that lasted for hours afterward. Every part of me wanted to cross that street. Every part of me wanted to sit down on those steps beside my grandson and tell him that the thing he loved was worth everything. That music was not a waste, that his grandmother had played every Sunday evening, and it had been the most sacred hour of my week for 30 years. I did not cross the street. I turned and walked away, because crossing it would have meant breaking whatever fragile legal boundary Victor had established, and I could not afford to give him a reason to move further away, or to take Ethan somewhere I could not find them. But I made a promise to myself that afternoon, standing on the sidewalk 3 blocks from the laundromat with bark patterns fading from my palm and my grandson's empty hands still visible behind my eyes. I promised that if the day ever came when I could reach Ethan again, I would make sure he knew that the music inside him was not a deficiency. It was an inheritance. Then, in my 7th year of that life, a small repair job arrived that opened a door I had not known I was still looking for. Her name was Lillian Park. Her name was Lillian Park, and she was 91 years old. And she found my number on the bulletin board at the Veterans Community Center on a Wednesday afternoon in late October. Her voice on the phone was the voice of someone who has learned to be persistent because the world has spent a long time assuming she can be redirected. She did not ask me if I was available. She told me she had a piano that needed restoring and that her children had told her to throw it away and buy something new, and that she could not do that. She said it in a way that did not require further explanation. I told her I would come by that evening and take a look. Her house was a small ranch-style place on the south side of Asheville, backed up against a wooded ridge that turned gold and copper in the October light. The front garden had been tended carefully for many decades and showed it. The kind of garden that does not shout, but speaks quietly about the character of the person who maintains it. When she opened the door, I saw the piano immediately. Because she had placed it in the center of the living room the way you place something important, the way you give a thing the space it deserves. It was a Steinway Grand, Model B, built in 1928. Her husband, a Jewish violinist who had fled Vienna in 1938 with his instrument under one arm, and this piano shipped separately on a cargo vessel that nearly did not make it across the Atlantic, had played it every evening of their 52-year marriage, until the night he did not wake up from his chair beside it. The piano was in serious condition. The lid had warped along its length from decades of humidity changes in the Carolina mountains. The ivory keys had yellowed unevenly, several chipped, 2 missing entirely. 3 strings had snapped and hung loose inside the cabinet like broken thoughts. The hammers were flattened and hard from years of use without reconditioning, and the sustain pedal was frozen in place. The rosewood case, which had once been the color of dark honey, had faded and cracked along the grain in the way old wood cracks when it has been through enough winters without the right care. A less patient eye would have looked at it and seen only damage. I looked at it and put my hand flat against the case and felt the grain beneath the surface, felt the quality of what had been made by someone who understood that a great piano is not a piece of furniture but a living thing, with a voice that deserves to be heard. I told Lillian I could restore it. I meant it the way I have always meant that particular sentence, not as a promise of perfection but as a commitment to listen to what the instrument had to say and to answer it honestly. I worked on that Steinway for 2 months in the corner of my room above the laundromat, most nights after 10 when the machines below had finished their last cycle and the building settled into a stillness that was almost silence. I replaced the broken strings with new German wire, matching the gauge and tension to the original specifications I found stamped inside the cabinet. I reconditioned every hammer by hand, reshaping the felt with a voicing needle until each one produced a tone that was round and warm rather than brittle. I soaked the frozen pedal mechanism in penetrating oil for 3 days, then freed it millimeter by millimeter with the patience of someone who has learned that forcing a thing never produces the same result as waiting for it. The keys were the most delicate work. I cleaned each one individually, repaired the chips with a composite. I mixed to match the original ivory tone, and replaced the 2 missing keys with salvaged pieces. I drove to an architectural salvage shop 2 towns over to find, because the keys on a piano like this are not decoration. They are the point of contact between a human hand and a century of music, and substituting something that did not belong would have been its own kind of violence. The rosewood case I sanded through 5 progressively finer grits, working slowly enough to feel the wood tell me when it had given up enough of its damaged surface and wanted me to stop. Then I applied 3 coats of hand-rubbed oil finish that brought the color back to something close to what it must have looked like when it first arrived in America on that cargo ship 86 years ago. A little darker now, a little deeper, carrying the evidence of its history rather than hiding from it. When I was finished, I sat back and looked at what it had been before I touched it and what it was now, and I felt the particular quiet that comes from having done something correctly. I loaded the Steinway into a rented truck on a Saturday morning and drove it back to Lillian's house and set it in the same spot in the center of her living room. Lillian stood in her doorway for a long time without speaking. She walked toward the piano slowly. The way you approach something you are not certain is real, and she reached out and ran her fingertips along the restored case, along the keys that were whole again, along the lid that sat level and true. Then she pressed 1 key, a single note, and the sound that came from inside that instrument filled the room the way light fills a room, when someone opens a curtain that has been drawn for a long time. She sat down on the bench and put both hands on the keys and played a passage I did not recognize, something in a minor key that moved with the careful tenderness of a conversation between two people who have not spoken in a while and are finding their way back to each other. Her shoulders began to shake, and she cried the way older people cry, quietly and without apology, because they have lived long enough to know that some moments earn their tears. She looked up at me and said, "You gave me back his hands. I can hear him playing again." And then she said something I have never forgotten. She said, "You fix things the way someone heals a broken heart, Harry, carefully, with respect for what it used to be." I did not know what to do with that. So I told her I was glad I could help, and refused most of what she tried to pay me, and left before the moment could get any heavier. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Lillian's granddaughter had filmed the moment Lillian sat down and played that passage, had captured the tears and the trembling hands and the sound of a Steinway coming back to life after years of silence, and she posted it to TikTok that same evening with a caption about craftsmanship and love, and the man who gave her grandmother back something she thought was gone forever. 3 days later, Dolores knocked on my door with her phone held out and said, "Harry, you need to see this right now." The video had been viewed 8 million times, and the phone had not stopped ringing since. The phone rang that evening for the first time in longer than I could easily remember. Then it rang again. Then it did not stop. The calls kept coming for days and then for weeks. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, I stopped waiting for them to slow down and started trying to keep up with them instead. People called from across the county and then from across the state. They had seen the video, or someone had shared it with them, or their daughter had shown it to them on a device they did not entirely understand, but that had made them cry in a way they could not explain. They all said some version of the same thing. "I have something that needs restoring. It belonged to someone I loved. Can you help me?" I took in more work than I had space for, which meant the room above the laundromat became impassable with piano parts in various stages of repair. Keyboards leaned against the walls, hammers soaked in jars on the kitchenette counter, strings hung in coils from hooks I had screwed into the ceiling beams. After about 3 weeks of turning sideways to get from the door to my workbench, I accepted that the space had stopped being sufficient. I found the building on a Tuesday afternoon while walking a route through downtown Asheville I had not taken before. It was a church, or it had been once. A small stone building set back from the street on a narrow lot between a barbershop and a used bookstore. The congregation had moved to a larger space on the other side of town sometime in the past decade, and the building had been sitting empty since, waiting with the patient stillness of a thing that knows its purpose has not ended, only paused. The front door was unlocked. I stepped inside and stood in the center of what had been the sanctuary and looked up. The ceiling was vaulted, rising to a peak where 2 beams crossed each other in a pattern that might have been structural and might have been devotional, and was probably both. Stained glass windows lined the east wall, throwing colored light across the stone floor in long rectangles of red and gold and blue that shifted as the clouds moved outside. The acoustics were immediate and obvious. I clapped my hands once, and the sound traveled up into the vault and came back to me rounded and warm and lingering, the kind of natural reverb that concert halls spend millions trying to engineer, and a small stone church in the mountains of North Carolina had simply been given. I signed a lease the following Monday. I painted the name Dawson Piano Revival in gold letters on the front glass window, hung a small brass bell above the door, and opened the Saturday after that. Within a week, I had more work than I could schedule into a single month. Word was traveling faster than I could follow it, moving through the older neighborhoods and the church circles and the veteran communities and the particular networks that exist between people who have known each other long enough to trust a recommendation, the way they trust a handshake. They came with photographs of pianos they needed restored. They came with the instruments themselves, loaded carefully into truck beds and station wagons, and once in the back of an ambulance that a retired paramedic had borrowed from a friend because it was the only vehicle he could find large enough to carry a concert, grand without tilting it. Every one of them had a story, and every one of them told it to me before they left the instrument in my care. Because that was the point, that was what they needed to know. I understood before they could leave something irreplaceable in the hands of a stranger. There was a widow from Black Mountain who brought an upright her husband had played every evening after dinner for 41 years. She said the house had been so quiet since he passed that some nights she sat beside the silent piano and put her hands on the closed lid just to feel close to where his hands had been. There was a retired Marine from Weaverville who carried in a battered spinet his mother had used to teach him chopsticks when he was 4 years old, and Amazing Grace when he was 6, and everything else he knew about tenderness when the world outside their apartment was not teaching him any. There was a pastor's daughter from Hendersonville with a church organ keyboard that had accompanied 60 years of Sunday hymns and still carried the faint smell of candle wax and wood polish in its case. Each one of them stood beside their instrument while they described it to me. And each one of them used the word important, or irreplaceable, or the only thing I have left of her. Dolores came by at the end of that first Saturday. She stood in the doorway where the colored light from the stained glass fell across her shoulders, and she watched the last customer drive away, and she shook her head slowly. She said, "Harry, you have found something people have been hungry for without knowing how to name it. You are not just fixing pianos. You are telling people that the music they were afraid had gone silent still has a voice." I thought about that for a long time after she said it. I thought about Margaret and the Sunday evenings and the way a house feels when the piano in it goes quiet. I thought about Ethan sitting on those porch steps with his empty hands after Victor took the keyboard away. I thought about silence and what it costs and what it means when someone finally breaks it. I was tuning a baby grand on a morning in early April when the brass bell above the door rang. I looked up and wiped my hands on my apron, and my heart stopped. He was standing in the doorway with the late morning light coming in behind him. And the first thing I saw before anything else, before I registered who he was or why he looked familiar, were his eyes, green-gray. A particular shade that I had loved for 30 years and thought I would never see again outside of photographs. They were Margaret's eyes. They were her exact eyes in a face that had aged differently but carried the same bone structure, the same quiet steadiness in the expression. It took me several seconds to understand who I was looking at, and when I did, the floor seemed to tilt slightly under my feet. It was Frank Calloway, Margaret's younger brother, standing in the doorway of my shop in a stone church in Asheville, looking at me the way someone looks at a thing they were not entirely sure still existed in the world. He said my name, and his voice broke on it, and he said, "I've been looking for you." He told me it had been 10 years of looking. He had tried calling the old house on Birch Lane and gotten no answer. He had written letters to the address he had and received nothing back. He had driven to Asheville 3 separate times and knocked on doors and been told different things by different people, none of them useful. He had almost given up. Then a video of a restored Steinway Grand had appeared on his phone screen, shared by a colleague at his real estate firm, and something about the man standing beside the piano had made him stop scrolling. He had zoomed in on my face and sat with it for a long time before he was certain. Then he drove 4 hours to get here. I asked him why he had stopped trying to reach me. I asked it carefully, because I did not want the question to sound like an accusation, when it was really a confusion that had been sitting inside me for a decade, without anywhere to go. Frank took out his phone and showed me an email. It had been sent from my account, from the address I had used for years, about 6 weeks after Margaret's funeral. It was formal and cool in a way I do not write and have never written. It said that I was overwhelmed by grief, that having Margaret's family present made the loss harder to bear, that I was asking for space and would reach out when I was ready. It was signed with my name. I had never written a single word of it. I had not known it existed until that moment in my shop, with Frank standing across the counter from me and Margaret's eyes looking at me from her brother's face. Before that email arrived, he told me Victor had called him about a month after the funeral. Victor had explained that I was struggling, that seeing Margaret's family was painful for me, that he would make sure I reached out when I felt ready. Frank had waited. Then the email came. And he had believed it because he had no reason not to. He said Margaret had told him something near the end, in one of those late-night conversations that serious illness makes possible when the body is failing but the mind refuses to leave without saying what it needs to say. She had told him that Victor had a way of closing spaces around people, of managing what information moved in which direction, of making sure that the version of events that reached the outside world was always the one that served him best. Frank said he had not understood what his sister meant at the time. Standing in my shop, he said he understood it now. We were quiet for a moment, with the full weight of 10 wasted years settling between us like dust in the colored light from the stained glass windows. Then Frank straightened and looked around the shop with the eyes of someone who has spent his career in commercial real estate and cannot help assessing what he sees. He looked at the instruments lined up along the walls, at the workbench with its careful arrangement of tools, at the brass bell above the door, and the gold letters on the glass and the vaulted ceiling that turned every sound into something larger than itself. He said he had not come only to find me. He said Margaret had left him a sum of money with specific instructions that it be used for something that would have made her proud, and that he had been waiting for the right way to honor those instructions, and that he believed he was standing in the middle of it. He wanted to invest in expanding the business. Real money. Enough to move into a proper space with the right equipment and room to grow. He said he was not offering charity. He said he knew a sound investment when he was standing in front of one. Then he paused, and his voice changed, and he said something that I heard in Margaret's cadence as clearly as if she had been standing beside him and speaking through him the way music sometimes speaks through an instrument it has chosen. He said Margaret wanted you to live, Harry, not survive. This is the difference. That evening I sat at Dolores's kitchen table while she read through every page of Frank's proposal, with the unhurried thoroughness of a retired teacher grading a final exam that she intended to get exactly right. She turned the pages slowly, made small notes in the margins with a pencil she kept behind her ear, and asked questions that were sharper and more precise than anything I would have thought to ask myself. When she finished, she set the document down and took off her reading glasses and looked at me across the table with those steady eyes that had been watching over me for 7 years. She said the terms are fair and the intent is clean. Then she said, "Sign it, Harry. Margaret is handing you a second chance. Do not you dare leave it on the table." I picked up the pen Margaret had given me on our 30th anniversary. A silver fountain pen she had engraved with the words "Play On." And I signed my name. And for the first time in 7 years, I felt something I had almost forgotten the shape of. I felt the future open. The phone call came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Frank signed the investment papers. I was elbow deep inside a 1947 Baldwin Acrosonic, replacing a cracked bridge pin, when Dolores appeared in the doorway holding her phone like it was a winning lottery ticket. "NPR," she said. "National. Public. Radio. They want to do a feature on you." I wiped my hands on a shop rag that had long since stopped being white. "I fix pianos, Dolores. I am not a story." She tilted her head the way she always did when she thought I was being deliberately foolish. "A 91-year-old Holocaust survivor's granddaughter posted a video of you giving her grandmother back 30 years of grief, and 8 million people watched it in 3 days. You are absolutely a story." The producer's name was Marco Ferris. He drove down from Washington in a rented Subaru, with recording equipment packed in 2 aluminum cases and a canvas bag full of microphones that looked like props from a science fiction film. He was maybe 35, thin, careful with his words, and he had the kind of quiet attention that made you forget the microphone was there. He spent the first day not recording at all. He walked through the shop, touched the pews I had kept along the back wall, ran his fingers across the brass bell above the door, and asked me to show him every tool I used. He wrote nothing down, but I could see him filing it all away behind those wire-rimmed glasses. On the second day, he set up 2 chairs by the front window, where the morning light came through the old stained glass, and painted amber rectangles on the pine floor. He pressed record and asked me to start wherever I wanted. So I started with Margaret. I told him about the way she hummed Claire de Lune while she cooked, always slightly off-key, and how I never corrected her because the imperfection was the most honest sound I had ever heard. I told him about the diagnosis. The way the word metastatic landed in that fluorescent-lit examination room, like a stone dropped into still water. I told him about the last Tuesday, the morphine, the moment her breathing changed, and the silence that followed, a silence so total, it felt like the world had been unplugged. Marco did not interrupt. He let the silences breathe. I told him about Victor and Christine arriving 3 weeks after the funeral, about the lock change, about the broken piano key. Ethan pressed into my palm before they drove away. I told him about the laundromat, the church piano with its stuck middle C, the years of envelopes in a cedar box. I told him about Lillian Park and the Steinway from Vienna, and the way her tears fell onto the restored keys, and I did not wipe them away because some water belongs where it lands. The interview ran 2 hours and 40 minutes. Marco used 19 minutes of it. The segment aired on a Saturday morning in late October, nestled between a story about Appalachian folk music preservation and a report on school funding in rural Georgia. Marco's voice opened the piece with a sentence that made Dolores cry the first time she heard it. In a converted stone church in Asheville, North Carolina, a man named Harold Dawson is proving that the things we thought were broken were only waiting for the right hands. Within 48 hours, the segment had been shared over 200,000 times. Emails flooded the shop's new address. A woman in Portland wrote that she had almost sold her mother's baby grand, but changed her mind after hearing the broadcast. A retired teacher in Baton Rouge drove 9 hours with a water-damaged upright strapped to the back of a flatbed truck. A veteran in Knoxville left a voicemail at 2 in the morning that said only, "Thank you for making it okay to hold on to things." Frank called from Savannah on Sunday night. "The phone at the new shop has not stopped ringing," he said. "We are going to need a bigger church." I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. It was a real laugh. The kind that starts in the belly and surprises you on the way out. Dolores, who was sitting on the front step with a bowl of pecans in her lap, looked up and smiled without saying a word, and I understood that she had been waiting for that sound, the way I waited for a tuning fork to stop trembling. But the broadcast did more than fill the shop with pianos. It reached a white 2-story house on Birch Lane, where a 17-year-old boy sat at a second-hand desk in a room with bare walls and a window that faced east. Ethan did not hear the segment live. He found it 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, through a classmate's Instagram story that had reposted a clip. He listened to it once with earbuds in, while Victor and Christine argued about an overdue electric bill in the kitchen below. Then he listened to it again. Then a third time. I know this because of what arrived in the post office box on Haywood Road 11 days later. A plain white envelope. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of lined notebook paper, torn carefully from a spiral binding. The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted to the left, the penmanship of someone who had been taught by a patient teacher, or had taught himself through repetition. It read, "Grandpa, I heard you on the radio. I still have the other half of the key. I never stopped listening. E." I sat on the metal folding chair beside the post office boxes for a long time. The paper smelled faintly of pencil graphite and something sweet. Maybe cereal, maybe youth. I folded it once, slid it into the cedar box next to the cash envelopes, and closed the lid. Then I walked back to the shop, sat down at Lillian Steinway, and played Claire de Lune all the way through for the first time since Margaret died. I played it slightly off-key on purpose, the way she would have wanted it. Outside, the brass bell swung once in a gust of autumn wind, and somewhere on Birch Lane, a 17-year-old boy was holding half a broken piano key and making a decision that would change everything. Frank drove me to Savannah on a Friday morning in early November, 2 weeks after Ethan's letter arrived. He did not tell me where we were going. He said only, "I need you to see something," and handed me a coffee from the gas station on Merrimon Avenue that was too sweet and too hot, which meant he had made it himself. We took I-26 east to I-95 south. 4.5 hours of pine corridor and flat Georgia sky. Frank talked for the first hour about Margaret, about summers in their parents' kitchen in Hendersonville, how she used to steal his baseball cards and hide them inside the piano bench because she knew he would never look there. He talked about the day she called him to say she had married me, how their father had disapproved because I did not have a degree, and how Margaret had said, "He has hands that listen, Daddy. That is worth more than paper." After that, Frank went quiet. He drove with both hands on the wheel, and his jaw set in a way that reminded me so much of Margaret before she delivered difficult news that I had to look out the window to steady myself. We crossed into Savannah just after 2 in the afternoon. The city opened the way it always does. Slowly, like a book whose pages are stuck together with humidity and history. Spanish moss hung from live oaks along Victory Drive. The air smelled of salt marsh and jasmine and something older. Something that had been there before the roads. Frank turned onto a street called Abercorn, then left onto a quieter road lined with iron fences and azalea hedges. He slowed the car and pulled to the curb beneath a magnolia tree whose trunk was wider than my workbench. "There," he said. I looked through the windshield and felt my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with age. It was a Victorian. 2 stories, with a wraparound porch supported by turned columns that someone had painted a soft cream. The siding was a muted sage green, the shutters a darker forest. There was a turret on the left side with 3 narrow windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in long gold bars. The front door was painted black, the kind of deliberate black that says this door has been chosen, not neglected. A wisteria vine climbed the eastern railing and had made itself so comfortable it looked structural. I knew this house, not because I had been here before. I had never been to this street, never walked this sidewalk, never stood beneath this magnolia. But I knew this house because Margaret had drawn it. She had sketched it in a leather-bound notebook she kept on her nightstand. The one with the cracked spine and the coffee ring on the cover. She drew it over and over, dozens of times, each version slightly different, adjusting the porch depth, the window count, the pitch of the roof. She never told me it was a real place. I assumed it was a dream, a someday house. The kind of thing people carry in their heads to get through the hours when the present is not enough. Margaret found this house in 2006, Frank said, still gripping the steering wheel. She called me from a payphone on Bull Street and said, "Frank, I found it. The one I have been drawing." She started saving that year. Small amounts, every month, into an account she never told anyone about. After she passed, I continued. And when the house came on the market 14 months ago, I made the offer. He reached into the glove box and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were documents, a deed, inspection reports, and a single photograph of Margaret, standing on Bull Street, with her hand shielding her eyes from the sun. On the back of the photograph in her handwriting, "For Harry, when he is ready." I could not speak. Frank opened his door and walked around to my side. He offered his hand, and I took it, not because I needed help standing, but because some gestures carry more weight than the physical act they perform. We walked up the brick path together. The porch boards were solid, recently replaced but stained to look original. I touched the railing and felt the grain beneath my fingers, smooth, honest, the kind of wood that had been cared for. The front door opened with a brass key Frank produced from his shirt pocket, and the interior unfolded in a sequence of rooms that felt less like a house and more like the inside of Margaret's mind. Hardwood floors, heart pine, darkened with age. A fireplace with a carved mantel. A kitchen with tall windows that faced a garden someone had planted with rosemary and lemon balm. And in the front parlor, in a rectangle of afternoon light, a space that was exactly the right size for a piano. I stood in that rectangle and pressed my palms together, the way I do when I am measuring a soundboard by feel. The air was warm and still, and carried the faint smell of old plaster and lemon oil. "There is one more thing," Frank said from the hallway. He led me upstairs to a room at the end of the corridor. It was small, painted a pale blue, with a single window that looked out over the garden. On the floor, still in its plastic wrapping, was a keyboard. Not expensive, not professional. A simple 61-key Yamaha, the kind a student might use. Taped to the wrapping was a note in Frank's handwriting. Guest room. For when he is ready too. I understood then that the house was not only for me. We spent the rest of the afternoon walking through rooms, measuring doorways, discussing where the workshop would go, which walls could hold shelving, whether the carriage house in the back could be converted into a finishing room. Frank had already drawn plans. Nancy, his wife, had chosen paint samples. The infrastructure of hope had been built while I was still learning how to breathe again. I slept that night in the parlor. On an air mattress Frank inflated with a hand pump. I listened to the house settle, the tick of cooling wood, the whisper of the wisteria against the window screen, the distant murmur of Savannah traffic that sounded like a river heard from the far side of a hill. I was almost asleep when the sound came. Tires on gravel. Slow. Deliberate. I went to the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to see the street below. A silver sedan idled beneath the magnolia tree, its headlights off, its engine running. Someone in the passenger seat was looking directly at the house. I did not sleep after the sedan disappeared. I lay on the air mattress in the parlor and watched the ceiling fan turn in slow, uneven circles, its rhythm slightly off, the way a metronome sounds when the spring is losing tension. Every few minutes I went to the window, pulled the curtain aside with 2 fingers, and studied the street. The magnolia stood in the dark, like a patient witness. The curb was empty, but the impression of those headlights, off yet somehow still watching, stayed pressed against the inside of my eyelids like a photograph burned into film. By 5 in the morning I gave up on rest. I made coffee in the kitchen using a French press Frank had left in a box labeled Essentials, along with a bag of dark roast, a tin of sugar, and a note from Nancy that read, "Welcome home, Harry. The garden needs weeding but the bones are good." I carried the mug to the front porch and sat in a rocking chair that was not mine, on a porch that still felt more like a promise than a possession, and watched Savannah wake up. The mist came first. It rose from the marsh beyond the tree line and drifted through the streets like something looking for an address it had forgotten. Then the birds, cardinals and mockingbirds, and a single crow that sat on the iron fence across the road and regarded me with the kind of suspicion I had come to expect from living things that had learned not to trust stillness. I drank my coffee slowly. I thought about Margaret's sketch, the way she had drawn this porch with a slight curve in the railing that the actual railing did not have, as if she had been correcting reality to match what she believed it should be. I thought about Ethan's letter in the cedar box, about the half of the broken key he said he still carried, about the 61-key Yamaha upstairs in its plastic wrapping, waiting in a pale blue room for a boy I had not spoken to in 10 years. I thought about the sedan. The morning passed in small, ordinary sounds. A neighbor's sprinkler clicking to life. A dog barking twice and then stopping, as if it had made its point. The distant hum of a lawnmower, starting somewhere on the next block. I brought my tools inside from Frank's truck and arranged them on the kitchen counter the way I always did. By function, and then by size, smallest to largest, because order is the first language of a man who has lost control of everything else. At 11:14, I heard it. Not the engine first. The tires. That particular sound of rubber on gravel, slow and deliberate. The sound of someone who knows exactly where they are going and wants you to hear them arrive. I set my coffee on the porch railing and stood. My hands were steady. I made sure of that. I pressed my fingertips together, checked for tremor, found none, and placed them flat against my thighs. The silver sedan rolled into view from the east end of the street and stopped directly in front of the house, beneath the magnolia, in the exact spot where it had idled the night before. The engine cut. For a long moment nothing moved. The morning light hit the windshield at an angle that turned it into a mirror, and I could not see inside. Only my own reflection staring back at me from across the yard, An old man on a porch that his dead wife had dreamed into existence. Then the doors opened. Christine stepped out from the passenger side first. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, cut close to the jaw in a way that made her face look sharper, more deliberate. She wore a linen blouse and pressed slacks and sunglasses pushed up onto her forehead. And she surveyed the house the way a contractor surveys a property before making a bid. Not with affection, with calculation. Victor came from the driver's side. He had aged in a way that looked less like time and more like erosion, the slow wearing away of something that had never been properly sealed. His shoulders were rounder. His shirt was untucked on one side. He stood by the car door with his hands in his pockets and did not look at the house. He looked at the ground, and then the rear door opened, and Ethan unfolded himself from the back seat. He was 17 now. Tall, thin in the way that teenage boys are thin when they have grown faster than their appetite can follow. His hair was dark and fell across his forehead, and he stood with his hands at his sides, fingers slightly curled, the posture of someone who plays piano, or wants to. He looked at the house, then at the porch, then at me. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were not. His eyes were Margaret's, dark brown, steady, carrying something behind them that was too large for his face. Christine crossed the yard first. Her heels sank slightly into the grass, and she adjusted her stride without breaking pace. The kind of minor correction that reveals practice. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, placed one hand on the railing, and smiled. It was the smile I had seen in Task 1. Rehearsed, measured, a smile that had been tested in a mirror and approved for deployment. "Dad," she said, "you have done so well for yourself. This place is gorgeous." She paused, letting the compliment settle the way a salesperson lets a price sit before adding the terms. "We thought we could stay for a while. Family should be together, right?" I looked at her. I looked past her at Victor, who still had not moved from the car. I looked at Ethan, who was watching me with those dark eyes that held half a broken piano key somewhere in his pocket and a letter that said I never stopped listening. I did not open the door. I reached behind me to the small table beside the rocking chair, picked up 3 bottles of water I had set there an hour ago, because I had known this moment was coming since 2 in the morning, and held them out over the railing. "Water," I said. "It is warm out here." Christine's smile did not waver, but something behind it shifted. A micro-adjustment, the facial equivalent of her heel sinking into grass. She took the bottles. She handed one to Victor without turning around. She did not offer one to Ethan. The porch stayed between us. The door stayed closed, and I could feel, in the silence that followed, the weight of every tool I had ever held, every string I had ever tuned, every broken thing I had ever made whole, gathering in my hands like a chord waiting to be struck. Christine stood on the bottom step for 11 seconds without speaking. I counted. When you have spent 10 years tuning instruments, you develop an internal clock that measures silence the way other people measure sound, by its texture, its weight, the precise moment it becomes unbearable. She broke first. "Can we at least come inside and talk?" she said. Like a family, I leaned against the porch column and folded my arms. "We can talk right here. The air is good." She glanced back at Victor, who had finally left the car, but stopped halfway up the brick path, as if an invisible line in the grass had told him this was as far as he was welcome. Ethan stayed near the sedan, one hand resting on the roof, his dark eyes moving between his mother and me, with the quiet attention of someone who has learned to read a room before entering it. "Fine," Christine said. She set the water bottles on the step and straightened her blouse. "Dad, we are in trouble." I said nothing. Victor lost his position at the firm 8 months ago. The severance ran out in March. We have been living on credit since April, and the cards are maxed. The house on Birch Lane. She paused, recalibrated. We are 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank has started proceedings. I watched Victor while she spoke. He did not look up. His hands were still in his pockets, and his shoulders had drawn in even further, as though his skeleton were trying to make itself smaller, to occupy less space in a conversation he clearly wished he could leave. "How much?" I asked. Christine blinked. "What? How much do you owe?" She hesitated. And in that hesitation, I saw the architecture of the lie she was constructing. The slight upward glance, the micropause, the recalculation. 140,000, she said. Give or take. Give or take, I repeated. It is mostly the mortgage. Some medical. Victor had a procedure last year. His back. And the insurance did not cover all of it. And there are the cards. And Ethan's school fees. And, Christine, she stopped. I did not ask for an itemized list. I asked how much. Victor spoke for the first time. His voice was lower than I remembered. Flatter. As if something inside it had been sanded down. 187,000, he said. Still looking at the ground. She rounded down. Christine turned to him with an expression that was not anger, but something worse. The look of a person whose script has been disrupted by an actor who has gone off book. Victor raised his head and met her eyes. And for a moment, something passed between them that I recognized from decades of watching couples argue in rooms where I was supposedly invisible, the silent negotiation of two people who have been lying in tandem, and one of them has just broken formation. 187, I said. And you drove 4.5 hours to tell me this on a Sunday morning. We drove 4.5 hours, Christine said, recovering, because you are family. Because this house has 5 bedrooms, and it is just you. Because Ethan needs stability. And you have room. And you thought you would move in. Temporarily. Temporarily. I let the word hang. I had learned from Dolores that repetition is not agreement. It is a mirror. You hold the word up and let the other person see what it looks like from the outside. Christine climbed one step, then another. She was on the porch now, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something floral and expensive that did not match the story she had just told about maxed credit cards and mortgage default. Dad, I know we have not been close. I know the last 10 years have been 10 years, I said. You changed the lock on my front door. Victor unscrewed the deadbolt with my own Phillips head while I stood in my own hallway holding a cup of coffee that was still warm. You took my grandson, drove away, and did not call, write, or send a single message for a decade. And now you are standing on a porch that your mother drew in a notebook she kept beside her bed while she was dying and telling me it is temporary. Christine's jaw tightened. I watched the muscles move beneath the skin. A small mechanical adjustment, like a hammer resetting inside a piano action. You are right, she said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone. What replaced it was something colder, cleaner. The voice she probably used in the conference rooms where she had spent her career before the career ended. You are right, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. We made choices, bad ones. But Ethan did not make those choices. And Ethan is 17. And Ethan needs, do not use my grandson as currency. The words came out quieter than I intended. But they landed hard. Christine took a half step back. Victor, on the path, closed his eyes. And then, from the sedan, a voice I had not heard in 10 years. Stop. It was not loud. It was not shouted. It was spoken the way a single note is played in a silent room. Clear, precise, carrying more weight than volume. Ethan walked up the brick path. He passed Victor without looking at him. He passed Christine without pausing. He climbed the porch steps and stood in front of me. And I saw that he was almost my height now, that his hands were large and his fingers were long, and his left thumb had a callus on the pad that could only come from pressing piano keys or guitar strings for hours at a time. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out something small. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, and the morning light caught it and made it glow like a piece of amber. Half a piano key. yellowed ivory, cracked along the same fracture line as the half I kept in my toolbox. "I did not come here because of the house," he said. "I came because of the radio. I came because of the Steinway. I came because you played Claire de Lune off-key, and I knew exactly why." He looked at me with Margaret's eyes, steady and deep, and holding something enormous behind them. "Grandpa," he said, "I came to learn." I looked at the half-key in Ethan's hand for a long time. Long enough that the mockingbird in the magnolia tree started a new phrase, cycled through it twice, and moved on to another. Long enough that Christine shifted her weight from one heel to the other, and Victor uncrossed his arms and crossed them again. Long enough that the morning light moved a full inch across the porch floor. Then I reached into my shirt pocket, where I had carried the other half every day for 10 years, and held it up beside his. The fracture lines matched. Of course they did. Some breaks are so clean they become a kind of language, a sentence split in two that only makes sense when you bring the halves together. Ethan looked at the joined pieces and his breath caught. A small, private sound. The kind of sound a piano string makes when you release the damper and let it ring for the first time. "Come inside," I said. Not to Christine, not to Victor, to Ethan. Christine started forward. I held up my hand, palm out. The same gesture I used to stop a client from touching a freshly lacquered soundboard. "Just him," I said. For now, the look on her face was something I will remember for a long time. It was not anger. Not exactly. It was the expression of a woman who had arrived at a negotiation table expecting to control the agenda and discovered that the agenda had been written without her. Ethan followed me through the black front door into the parlor. His sneakers were quiet on the heart pine floor. He moved the way musicians move through unfamiliar spaces. Carefully. As if the room itself might be an instrument he did not want to disturb. He looked at the fireplace mantel, the tall windows, the rectangle of light where a piano would go. He did not say anything, but his fingers twitched at his sides. And I knew he was measuring the space the same way I did. By feel, by instinct, by the silent mathematics that lives in the hands of people who make things. I led him to the kitchen. On the counter, beside Frank's French press and Nancy's paint samples, sat the cedar box. It was small, no larger than a shoebox, with a hinged lid I had fitted myself using salvaged brass hardware from a church organ casing. The wood was Eastern red cedar, the kind that smells like pencil shavings and old closets, and something faintly medicinal. I had sanded it through 6 grits and finished it with 3 coats of tung oil until the grain glowed like a living thing. On the lid, carved with a 1/4-inch chisel in letters I had practiced on scrap wood for 2 days before committing to the final surface, were 2 words. For Ethan. I set it on the kitchen table and stepped back. "Open it," I said. He sat down. He ran his fingers over the carved letters the way I had taught myself to run fingers over piano keys. Lightly at first, then with purpose. He lifted the lid. Inside were 47 white envelopes, arranged chronologically. Oldest at the bottom, newest on top. Each one had been opened with a letter opener. The flaps sliced clean. Inside each envelope was cash. Sometimes $10, sometimes $20, once $50. At the very top, resting on the last envelope, was his letter, the one with the spiral binding edge and the left slanting handwriting and the words I never stopped listening. "I do not know who sent the money," I said. "There was never a return address. They started arriving about a year after you left. 1 every month. Sometimes 2. I kept every dollar. I never spent any of it." Ethan lifted the envelopes one at a time. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight. The way a boy holds himself when he is trying very hard to be something other than a boy. "There is $4,640 in that box," I said. "I counted it last Tuesday." He set the envelopes down and looked at me. "You knew I was the one sending them. It was not a question." "I suspected," I said. After the 3rd one, the postmark was always Asheville. The stamps were always crooked. the way a child sticks them on, before learning where the corner is. By the 5th one, I was almost certain. By the 10th, I stopped needing certainty. Mom does not know, he said quietly. I mowed lawns, shoveled driveways, tutored math at the library. I told her I was saving for a car. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. The kitchen was warm with afternoon light, and the smell of cedar, and the particular gravity that fills a room when two people are finally saying the things they have carried for a decade. Why? I asked. He thought about it. Not the way adults think about difficult questions, with deflection and qualification. The way a 17-year-old thinks, directly, honestly, with the unfinished courage of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of the truth. Because you kept playing, he said. After Mom took everything, after the house, after the lock, after all of it, you kept playing. I heard about the church piano from Mrs. Patterson at school. Her daughter goes to First Baptist. She said some man was coming in every Thursday night and fixing the piano for free and playing it until midnight. She did not know it was you, but I did. I knew because of how she described the sound. He paused. She said it sounded like someone talking to somebody who was not in the room. I pressed my palms flat on the table. The wood was cool and smooth, and the grain ran in parallel lines that reminded me of piano wire seen from above. That is exactly what it was, I said. We sat in silence for a while. It was not the loaded silence of the porch. It was the other kind. The kind that exists between two people who have just found the same note and are letting it sustain. Then we both heard it at the same time. A car door closing outside. Not the sedan. A different sound. Heavier. More deliberate. Footsteps on the brick path. Confident. Unhurried. A knock on the front door. 3 sharp raps delivered with the knuckles of someone who was accustomed to being answered. Ethan looked at me. I stood, walked to the parlor, and opened the black door. On the porch stood a woman I had not seen in nearly 11 years. She was tall, silver-haired, and she carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a manila folder in the other. Behind her, Christine and Victor stood frozen on the lawn like 2 actors who had just realized they were in the wrong play. "Hello, Harry," the woman said. "I am Judith Calloway, Margaret's sister, and I believe we have quite a bit to discuss." Judith Calloway entered the house the way a surgeon enters an operating room. Without hesitation, without small talk, and with both hands occupied by instruments she fully intended to use. She placed her leather briefcase on the parlor floor and the manila folder on the fireplace mantel. She looked around the room once, slowly, taking inventory the way Margaret used to when they visited antique stores together, assessing everything, dismissing nothing. Then she looked at me. "You look well, Harry," she said. "Better than I expected." "You look like your sister," I said. Something softened behind her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then it was gone, replaced by the professional composure of a woman who had spent 34 years practicing corporate law in Charlotte and had not retired so much as repositioned. "Is that my nephew's boy in the kitchen?" she asked. "Ethan. He is 17. I know how old he is." She set her purse on the rocking chair and turned toward the front door, which I had left open. Through it, framed by the porch columns like figures in a painting they had not consented to, stood Christine and Victor. "Come in," Judith said. Not to them, to the situation. She was summoning the confrontation the way a judge summons a witness, with authority that did not require permission. Christine entered first. She had removed her sunglasses, and without them, her face looked younger and more uncertain, as if the glasses had been structural rather than decorative. Victor followed 2 steps behind, his hands no longer in his pockets but hanging at his sides in the posture of a man who has stopped trying to look comfortable. Judith gestured to the parlor. "Sit." There were no chairs yet. Only the air mattress and 2 wooden crates Frank had used to carry tools. Christine perched on the edge of a crate. Victor leaned against the wall near the window. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway and stayed there, the cedar box still on the table behind him. Judith opened the manila folder. 6 weeks after Margaret's death, she said, addressing Christine directly, an email was sent from Harry's account to every member of the Calloway family. The email stated that Harry had decided to relocate to Cork, Ireland, to be closer to Margaret's maternal relatives. It included a forwarding address, a phone number with an international prefix, and a brief message expressing gratitude for the family's support during the funeral and requesting privacy during the grieving period. She removed a printed page from the folder and held it up. I recognized the format. Gmail, the old interface, with my name in the sender field and a timestamp from 11 years ago. I received this email. Judith continued. Frank received it. Our cousin Diana, in Raleigh, received it. Our Aunt Rosemary, in Flat Rock, received it. Every person who might have looked for Harry after Margaret's passing received this email, and every one of us believed it, because it came from his account, and it sounded like something a grieving man might do. She turned to me. Harry, did you send this email? No, I said. I have never been to Ireland. I do not have relatives there. Margaret's maternal family is from Brevard, North Carolina, not Cork. Judith nodded, as if confirming something she had already proven to herself long ago. She pulled a second document from the folder. I had a forensic IT specialist examine the email metadata 18 months ago, after Frank showed me the TikTok video and I realized Harry had never left Asheville. The email was sent from an IP address registered to a residential internet account on Birch Lane. She paused. Your house, Christine. Christine did not move. Her face had gone very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm, but the absence of all available responses. That is circumstantial, Victor said from the wall. His voice was flat, mechanical, the voice of a man reading from a script he had prepared for a moment he hoped would never arrive. It is, Judith agreed. Which is why I also obtained the login records. She produced a third page. The email account password was changed 4 days after Margaret's funeral. The change was initiated from the same IP address. The new password was used to send the Cork email, delete the sent copy from the outbox, and then change the password again. Harry's original password, which I happen to know because Margaret told me years ago it was the serial number of his first piano, was never restored. She looked at Christine. You hacked his email. You impersonated him. You told his wife's entire family that he had left the country so that no one would come looking for him. You isolated a 65-year-old widower from every person who might have helped him, and you did it within 6 weeks of his wife's death. The room was silent. Not the sustaining silence Ethan and I had shared in the kitchen. This was the other kind. The silence that precedes structural failure. The sound a beam makes just before it gives. Christine's hands were folded in her lap. Her fingers were interlocked so tightly, the knuckles had gone white. She looked at Victor. Victor looked at the floor. She looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at me. I can explain, Christine said. You will have the opportunity, Judith replied. But not yet. There is more. She reached into the briefcase and withdrew a second folder. Thicker than the first, secured with a rubber band. She set it on the mantel beside the first. Margaret left instructions, Judith said. Not in her will. Separately, in a sealed letter delivered to my office 3 days before she died, with directions that it not be opened until either Harry or I had reason to believe the family had acted against his interests. She tapped the folder. I opened it 14 months ago. Christine stood up. The motion was abrupt, unsteady, as if the crate beneath her had shifted. She took one step toward Judith, then stopped. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Her left hand reached for the wall and missed it by 2 inches. What did it say? Christine whispered. Judith looked at her with an expression that held no. Judith looked at her. Only the precise clinical attention of someone who has spent decades separating truth from its imitations. Sit down, Christine, she said. Christine did not sit. Her knees buckled first. A small lateral give, like a hinge, folding inward. Then her hand found the wall and slid down it, fingers trailing across the plaster, and she sank to the floor in a motion that was neither dramatic nor controlled. It was the movement of a body whose architecture had simply stopped supporting the weight of what it was carrying. Victor moved toward her. Judith held up one hand. "She is fine," Judith said. "She is not fainting. She is recalculating." From the kitchen doorway, Ethan watched his mother on the floor. His expression did not change, but his hand, the one that had held the half-key, moved slowly to his chest and pressed flat against his sternum, as if holding something in place that was trying to escape. Christine stayed on the floor for 90 seconds. I know because the grandfather clock in my head was still running, the one that counts silence and heartbeats and measures the distance between what people say and what they mean. When she stood, she used the wall. Both palms flat, fingers spread, the way a person steadies themselves on a ship that has changed direction without warning. She did not look at Judith. She looked at me. "Whatever Margaret wrote," she said. "It was written by a dying woman. Dying people say things they do not mean." Judith opened the second folder, but did not remove anything from it. She held it open like a book she was not yet ready to read aloud. "Before we get to Margaret's letter," Judith said, "there is one more piece of evidence I need to present. It did not come from me. It came from someone who has been watching this family far longer and far more carefully than any of you realized." She walked to the front door and opened it. Dolores Vega stood on the porch in a navy cardigan and flat shoes, holding a canvas tote bag against her chest the way a woman holds a newborn, protective, deliberate, aware of its fragility and its power. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, because Dolores had never in her life waited for permission to do the right thing. "Hello, Harry," she said. Then she looked at Christine and Victor with an expression I had seen only once before. On the Saturday morning she told me about her son, who had stolen her pension and moved to Nevada. It was not hatred. It was the exhausted clarity of a woman who had finished being surprised by cruelty and had moved on to documenting it. She reached into the tote bag and produced a device I recognized, a Sony digital voice recorder, silver, slightly scratched, the same one she kept on the windowsill of her apartment above the laundromat. She set it on the fireplace mantel beside Judith's folders. "I have lived next door to Harry for 9 years, Dolores said. "In that time, I have watched him rebuild his life from a folding cot and a bag of tools. I have also watched other things, things that came to his door, things that were said on his porch when people thought no one was listening." She pressed play. The first recording was dated 3 years ago. Victor's voice, unmistakable in its flatness, speaking to someone on a phone call he had made while sitting in his car outside the laundromat. Dolores's window had been open. The autumn air had carried every word. "The old man is still here. He is not going anywhere. Chris wants to wait until the property value goes up, then make the move. If he dies before that, it is easier. If he does not, we have the letter." The room did not breathe. Victor pushed himself off the wall. His face had gone the color of wet cement. "That is taken out of context," he said. Dolores pressed a button. The second recording, dated 18 months ago. Christine's voice this time, sharp, efficient, speaking to Victor in what sounded like a kitchen, dishes clinking in the background. "Judith is getting suspicious. Frank sent her something about a video. We need to move the timeline up. Tell Ethan we are visiting colleges in Georgia. Do not mention Harry. Do not mention the house." Christine closed her eyes. The third recording was the most recent, dated 5 weeks ago. Victor again, this time in the sedan, parked on the street outside the Victorian. Dolores had not been present for this one. The recording had come from a different source. A device Dolores had given to Frank 6 months earlier. A small microphone concealed inside the magnetic key box under the sedan's rear bumper. Victor's voice speaking to Christine in the passenger seat. "We go in soft. You do the talking. Use the family angle. Use Ethan. Use whatever you need. If he says no, we show him the letter. The one from Margaret. He will not be able to tell it is not real. I matched her handwriting from the birthday cards in the attic. 3 months of practice. It is perfect. A pause. Then Christine. And if he still says no? Victor. Then we file for adverse possession. We have the email proving he abandoned the property. We have the forwarding address. We have 10 years of absence. Any court in Georgia will side with us. Silence. I looked at Victor. He was standing very straight now. Straighter than he had stood all morning, as if his spine had finally received the message that collapse was no longer an option. His eyes moved from the recorder to Judith to Dolores to me. Calculating exits, the way a man calculates exits in a building that has just caught fire. Those recordings were obtained without consent, he said. His voice had changed. The flatness was gone. What replaced it was something thinner, sharper. The voice of a man who has stopped pretending to be a passenger and revealed himself as the driver. Georgia is a one-party consent state for phone calls. But in-person recordings require... Georgia requires one-party consent for all recordings, Judith said. Dolores was the consenting party for the first two. Frank was the consenting party for the third. I verified the statute before I drove here. Would you like the citation? Victor said nothing. There is also the matter of the forged letter. Judith continued. She reached into the second folder and produced a clear plastic sleeve containing a single sheet of cream-colored stationery. The handwriting was Margaret's, or rather, it was meant to be Margaret's. The same gentle slope, the same rounded vowels, the same way she crossed her T's with a slight upward lift. But I saw it immediately. The way you see a wrong note in a chord even before your brain names the frequency. Margaret dotted her. Eyes to the left. Always. A small, consistent asymmetry. Like a pianist who favors the sustain pedal on the second beat. The forgery dotted them dead center. He practiced for 3 months, I said quietly, and missed the one thing that mattered most. Victor's jaw tightened. He looked at Christine on the floor. He looked at Ethan in the doorway. He looked at the front door, still open, the November light falling through it in a long amber rectangle. Then he did something I did not expect. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out the car keys, and held them up in front of Christine. Not offering. Displaying. The way a man holds up a white flag before deciding whether to wave it or set it on fire. We are leaving, he said. His voice was ice. Not the poetic kind. The real kind. The kind that forms on roads at night and causes accidents no one sees coming. He turned toward the door. And as he passed Ethan, he leaned in close enough that only the 3 of us nearest could hear, and whispered something that made Ethan's face go completely white. Then he walked out the door, down the porch steps, and into the November light, the keys swinging from his index finger, like a metronome counting down to something none of us were ready for. Ethan did not tell me what Victor whispered. Not immediately. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hand still pressed against his sternum and his face drained of color. And when I asked him if he was all right, he shook his head once, the kind of shake that means I will tell you later, when there are fewer people in the room and fewer pieces of me on the floor. Outside, Victor had not left. He stood beside the sedan with the keys in his hand, staring at the house, as if waiting for it to do something. Christine was still inside, sitting on the crate again, her hands in her lap, her composure slowly reassembling itself into something that looked functional but was clearly provisional. Judith closed the folder. Dolores turned off the recorder. The room smelled of cedar and old plaster and the particular chemical scent of adrenaline that comes off people who have been cornered. Then Christine spoke. I am sick, she said. Not to Judith. Not to Dolores. To me. I was diagnosed in June. Breast cancer. Stage 2, left side. I have completed 4 rounds of chemotherapy, and I am scheduled for a 5th in January. The oncologist says the margins are favorable, but the prognosis depends on continued treatment, and continued treatment depends on insurance, and insurance depends on Victor's employment, which ended 8 months ago. She delivered this the way she had delivered everything else. With structure, with control, with the rehearsed precision of a woman who has learned that vulnerability is most effective when it is organized. But something in her voice cracked on the word margins. A hairline fracture. The kind you do not see until light passes through it at the right angle. I sat down on the air mattress. Not because I needed to, because some information arrives with a weight that your legs acknowledge before your mind does. Why did you not tell me? I said. Because we were not speaking, she said. Because I did not know where you were. Because by the time I found out you were still in Asheville, I was already on round 2. And Victor had already decided the house was the plan. The house was never the plan, Judith said from the mantel. The house was the trap. And the trap was Victor's. Christine flinched. It was small, involuntary. The twitch of a muscle that has been struck at its reflex point. Victor is the one who found the adverse possession statute, Judith continued. Victor is the one who practiced Margaret's handwriting. Victor is the one who sent the cork email from your IP address while you were at work, Christine. I am not saying you are innocent. You allowed it. You participated. But the architecture of this deception is his. And the reason it exists is not your illness or your debt. It exists because Victor has been planning to acquire this property since before Margaret died. She let that settle. How do you know that? Christine asked. Judith reached into the briefcase and produced a single document, a printed email chain between Victor and a real estate attorney in Atlanta, dated 14 months before Margaret's funeral. The subject line read, Savannah Property Inheritance Timeline and Transfer Options. He was pricing out your father's future before your mother was in the ground, Judith said. The cancer, the debt, the job loss, those are real. I do not doubt that, but they are not why he is here. He is here because this house is worth $680,000, and he has been calculating how to take it since 2012. The room changed, not the temperature, the density. The air became heavier. The way air becomes heavier before a storm, when the barometric pressure drops and every living thing knows something is coming but cannot name it. Christine looked at the front door, still open, where Victor stood beside the sedan in the November light. For the first time since she had arrived, her expression was not rehearsed. It was the face of a woman seeing the scaffolding she had built her life on, revealed as someone else's blueprint. A car pulled up behind the sedan. Black, clean, unremarkable. A man stepped out carrying a briefcase thinner than Judith's and a single white envelope. He was perhaps 50, with wire-rimmed glasses and the deliberate posture of someone who bills by the quarter hour. That is Marcus Webb, Judith said. Margaret's estate attorney. I asked him to be here. Marcus walked past Victor without acknowledging him, climbed the porch steps, and entered the parlor the way lawyers enter rooms, as if the room had been expecting him. Mr. Dawson, he said, shaking my hand. I apologize for the circumstances. I had hoped to do this in an office. He opened the envelope and removed a document, 6 pages, stapled, bearing the seal of a probate court in Buncombe County. Margaret Calloway Dawson established an irrevocable trust in 2011, he said. The trust holds this property, the Savannah Victorian, as well as the investment accounts that funded its purchase and renovation. The beneficiary of the trust is Harold Dawson during his lifetime. Upon Harold's death, the secondary beneficiary is Christine Dawson Hale, contingent upon 3 conditions. He read them aloud. 1. Completion of a minimum 12-month program of family therapy with a licensed counselor. 2. Verified employment, full-time, for a minimum of 24 consecutive months. 3. Resolution of all outstanding personal debts to a 0 balance, excluding mortgage. Verified by independent audit. He looked up from the document. Until those 3 conditions are met, the property cannot be sold, transferred, subdivided, or encumbered by any party, including the primary beneficiary. The trust is irrevocable. It cannot be amended, and it cannot be challenged by adverse possession, because the legal title does not rest with Harry. It rests with the trust. Christine stared at Marcus, then at Judith, then at the document in his hands. She planned this, Christine whispered. She protected him, Judith said. There is a difference. Marcus set the document on the mantel beside the folders and the recorder, a small library of evidence accumulating on the fireplace, like exhibits in a trial that had been 10 years in the making. There is one more element, Marcus said. He produced a second document from the envelope, a single page. A waiver. If Christine wishes to relinquish her contingent beneficiary status voluntarily, she may do so. In exchange, the trust will release a one-time distribution of $40,000 to cover immediate medical expenses. The offer is valid for 30 days. Christine took the waiver. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly, the way people read when the words are too heavy to process silently. Then she folded it, placed it in her lap, and closed her eyes. Outside, Victor had heard enough. I watched through the open door as he climbed into the sedan, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb without closing the passenger door. The door swung open and shut once as he turned the corner, and then the street was empty except for the Magnolia and Marcus's black car and the fading sound of tires on asphalt, moving fast, moving away, a man in full retreat from a house he had spent a decade trying to steal. He left Christine on a crate in the parlor. He left Ethan in the kitchen doorway. He did not say goodbye to either of them. Nobody moved for a long time after the sedan disappeared. Judith closed her briefcase. Marcus placed his pen in his breast pocket. Dolores stood by the window watching the empty street, the way a lighthouse watches the sea after a ship has gone down, not searching, just bearing witness. Christine sat on the crate with the waiver folded in her lap, and Ethan remained in the kitchen doorway, his hand still pressed to his chest, holding something invisible in place. I was the one who broke the silence. Judith, I said. The letter. She looked at me. For the first time since she had arrived, her composure softened into something that was not professional. It was personal. It was the face of a woman who was about to read her dead sister's handwriting aloud in a room full of people who had failed her. She opened the second folder and removed a cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with wax, a deep burgundy, pressed with an imprint I recognized immediately, Margaret's thumbprint. She had used the same seal on our wedding invitations 39 years ago. Heating a stick of wax over a candle and pressing her thumb into it before it cooled, because she said a thumbprint was more honest than a monogram. Judith broke the seal carefully. She unfolded 2 pages of Margaret's handwriting, the real handwriting, with the I's dotted to the left, and the T's crossed with that slight upward lift, and the particular way she looped her G's that always reminded me of the treble clef. She asked me to read it aloud, Judith said. To whoever was in the room when it was opened, she began, Harry, if Judith is reading this, then something has gone wrong, and I am sorry for that. I hoped it would not. I hoped that the people I loved would be better than my fear of them. But I have watched Victor for 7 years now, and I have seen what he is building inside Christine. And I want you to know that I saw it, even if I could not stop it. I am writing this on a Tuesday. You are downstairs fixing the church piano again. I can hear you through the floor, and the sound is the only thing that has made me feel safe in weeks, because it means you are still here, still working, still turning broken things into music. That is what you do, Harry. That is what you have always done. I set up the trust, because I know what is coming, not the specifics. I do not know what lie they will tell, or what door they will try to close, but I know the shape of it, the way you know the shape of a crack in a soundboard before you see it, by the sound it makes when you tap the wood. Judith paused. She removed her glasses, cleaned them with the hem of her sleeve, and put them back on. Her hands were steady, but her voice had thinned, the way a piano wire thins when it is tuned to its highest sustainable pitch. She continued, "The house in Savannah is real. I found it in 2006, and I have been saving for it since. Frank knows. Judith knows. You did not. Because I wanted it to be the one thing that could not be taken from you by someone who learned your email password. I need you to understand something. The trust is not punishment for Christine. It is a path. The three conditions, therapy, employment, debt resolution, those are not walls. They are doors. I chose them because they are the things Christine needs to do to become the person she was before Victor taught her to be someone else. If she meets them, she inherits. Not because she earned the house, but because she earned herself back, and Ethan. I have watched that boy sit at the piano bench when he thinks no one is looking, pressing the keys so softly they barely make a sound. He plays the way you play, Harry. Like the music is already inside him, and he is just giving it permission to leave. Take care of him. Not because Christine cannot. Because someone should show him that tenderness is not the same as weakness, and that the quietest hands in the room are usually the strongest. I love you. I have loved you since the afternoon. You tuned my father's piano and told me the F sharp was flat, and I said, "How can a sharp be flat?" And you laughed and said, "That is the whole problem with music and with people. We name things wrong, and then wonder why they do not sound right. Keep playing, even when the room is empty. Especially when the room is empty." Margaret. Judith folded the pages and placed them on the mantel. She did not cry, but she stood very still for a moment, the way a conductor stands after the last note of a symphony, holding the silence as part of the composition. Christine was crying. Not the organized kind. The other kind. The kind that comes from a place below the ribs, where language has no jurisdiction. Her shoulders shook and her hands covered her face, and the waiver slid from her lap to the floor, and for the first time since she had arrived, she was not performing. She was just a woman in a room where her dead mother had loved her enough to build a door she could not yet walk through. Ethan crossed the room. He did not go to Christine. Not yet. He came to me. He stood in front of the fireplace, in the rectangle of afternoon light where the piano would go. And he reached into his pocket and placed both halves of the broken key on the mantel beside Margaret's letter. She said, "The quietest hands are the strongest," he said. She did. She said, "Keep playing." She did. He looked at the two halves. Yellowed ivory, cracked along a fracture line that was 10 years old and still perfectly aligned. "Then teach me," he said. "Everything. Starting tonight. Starting now." I picked up both halves. I held them together in my palm, the fracture sealed by the pressure of my fingers, whole again for the first time in a decade. Then I reached into my toolbox, the one Frank had carried in from the truck, and found a small bottle of bone glue I used for ivory restoration. "This glue takes 24 hours to set," I said. "But once it does, the bond is stronger than the original material." Ethan watched me apply a thin line of adhesive along the fracture. I pressed the two halves together, held them for 30 seconds, and set the mended key on the mantel beside Margaret's letter. 24 hours, I said. "I can wait," he said. Behind us, Christine picked the waiver up from the floor. She unfolded it, read it one more time, and placed it on the crate beside her. Then she looked at Ethan, and at me, and at the glued key drying on the mantel in the last of the November light. She did not sign it. Not yet. But she held it the way a person holds a door handle before deciding which direction to turn it. Christine signed the waiver on a Thursday morning, 4 days after Margaret's letter was read. She did not call first. She drove to Savannah alone in a rental car, a white Hyundai that looked nothing like the silver sedan, and parked on the street beneath the magnolia. I was on the porch with a cup of coffee. The same place I had been every morning since moving in, because routine is the scaffolding grief builds when it is ready to become something else. She climbed the steps and placed the signed document on the railing beside my cup. "I am not doing this because of the money," she said. I know. I am doing it because she was right. About Victor. About the conditions. About all of it. She saw what I could not see, or what I would not. And she built a way out that I was too proud to recognize as a door. She sat in the rocking chair beside mine, the one Frank had brought from a salvage yard in Pooler. And for the first time in 10 years, my daughter and I sat on the same porch without a locked door between us. We did not speak for a long time. The magnolia caught the morning light and held it the way old trees hold light, patiently, without urgency, as if it had been practicing for exactly this. The 40,000 will cover the next 3 rounds, she said eventually. After that, I will figure it out. You will not figure it out alone, I said. She looked at me. Her eyes were tired. Not the fatigue of a single sleepless night, but the accumulated exhaustion of a decade spent maintaining a lie that had finally been set down. Ethan wants to stay, she said. I know. He told me. Is that all right? The room upstairs is already his. Frank put a keyboard in it before I moved in. Margaret would have wanted it. She nodded. She did not cry this time. She had passed through the crying and come out on the other side into a quieter place. The place where decisions live after the emotions that birthed them have been spent. 3 weeks later, on the first Saturday of December, I set a table in the parlor. Not a formal table. A workbench, actually, the largest one from the shop, an 8-foot slab of reclaimed oak that I had sanded and oiled until it glowed like honey in the afternoon light. I placed it in the center of the room, beneath the brass chandelier Frank had wired the previous weekend, and surrounded it with 8 chairs, each one different, each one salvaged from a different restoration project, a Windsor from a farmhouse in Flat Rock, a ladderback from a church in Black Mountain, a pressed-back oak from Lillian Park's dining room that she insisted I take because she said a chair that has held 91 years of dinners deserves a few more. 8 chairs. 8 place settings. Dolores brought empanadas and a sweet potato pie she claimed was her mother's recipe, but which I suspected involved a significant amount of improvisation. Frank and Nancy arrived with wine and a casserole dish wrapped in a towel that smelled of rosemary and butter. Judith came alone, carrying a bottle of bourbon and a photograph of Margaret at 19, standing in front of a piano at a recital hall in Brevard, her fingers still touching the keys, her eyes already looking at something beyond the frame. Lillian Park did not come. She had passed quietly in her sleep 2 weeks earlier, at 91. In the ranch-style house near Asheville, where the Steinway still stood in the front room with its lid open. Her granddaughter sent a card that said, "She told me to tell you the piano is still in tune." Marcus Webb declined the invitation but sent a handwritten note wishing us well. Christine arrived last. She brought nothing except herself, which was enough. She sat in the Windsor chair at the far end of the table and placed her hands flat on the oak surface and closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the grain the way I had taught Ethan to feel a soundboard, with patience, with attention, with the understanding that wood remembers everything that has ever been pressed against it. Ethan sat beside me. He had been living in the pale blue room for 3 weeks now, practicing scales every evening on the Yamaha, his long fingers finding the keys with increasing confidence. He was not good yet. He was better than that. He was willing. We ate. We talked. Frank told a story about Margaret hiding his baseball cards in the piano bench. Dolores told a story about her first day above the laundromat, how she heard me playing through the floor and thought the building was haunted. Judith raised a glass to Margaret and said, "She was the smartest person in every room, and she made sure we would not know it until we needed to." After dinner, Ethan stood up. He walked to the corner of the parlor where the Steinway now lived, the same instrument I had restored for Lillian, which her granddaughter had donated to Dawson Piano Revival with a note that said, "Grandma said it should go where the hands are." He sat on the bench. He adjusted his posture the way I had shown him. Spine straight. Shoulders relaxed. Wrists level. He placed his fingers on the keys. He played Clair de Lune. Not perfectly. Not the way a concert pianist plays it. with technical precision and interpretive authority. He played it the way Margaret used to hum it while she cooked, slightly off-key, slightly hesitant, with the particular tenderness of someone who knows the music is bigger than their hands but plays it anyway. Because the attempt is the point. I listened. Dolores listened. Frank closed his eyes. Judith pressed her fingertips together, beneath her chin. Christine watched her son play with an expression I had never seen on her face before. An expression that was not pride exactly, but recognition, the look of a woman seeing something in her child that she had once had and lost, and was now watching come back to life in a different body. The last note hung in the room like a held breath. Nobody clapped. Some moments are too complete for applause. I looked around the table. 8 chairs. 7 people. 1 empty seat, where Lillian would have sat, holding a glass of bourbon and telling us all that we were playing too softly. The November light had faded into the blue-gray of early evening, and the chandelier cast a warm circle over the oak surface, illuminating the grain, the knots, the scars, the places where the wood had been damaged and repaired and made, in the mending, more beautiful than it had been before. That is what I do. I take broken things and I find the fracture, and I sit with it, and I learn its shape, and I fill it with something stronger than what was there before. Not because the break did not matter. Because it did. Margaret knew that. She knew it before I did. She built a trust not to keep people out, but to give them a reason to come back whole. She drew a house in a notebook because she believed that the things we imagine for the people we love have a way of becoming real if we are patient enough to let them. She sealed a letter with her thumbprint because she knew that the truest signature is not a name. It is the mark you leave when you press your whole self against something and hold it there until it sets. We spend our lives afraid of the broken things. The cracked key, the warped lid, the silent piano in the corner of a room no one enters. We walk past them. We cover them with sheets. We tell ourselves they are beyond repair because admitting they can be fixed means admitting we are the ones who must do the fixing. But here is what 10 years above a laundromat taught me. The fracture is not the end of the story. It is the place where the story begins to mean something. Every broken string I have restrung, every warped hammer I have reshaped, every yellowed key I have polished back to white has taught me the same lesson. The damage is not the thing that defines you. What defines you is whether you sit down, pick up the tool, and begin. If you are sitting in a room right now with something broken beside you, a relationship, a dream, a promise you made to someone who is no longer here, I want you to know that the glue exists. It has always existed. It is patience, and it is presence, and it is the willingness to hold 2 halves together for 24 hours and trust that the bond will hold. Margaret taught me that. Ethan reminded me. And now, I am telling you, if this story touched something in you, if you saw yourself in Harry's porch or Ethan's half key or Margaret's letter, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to this channel so you do not miss what comes next. Leave a comment and tell me, what is the one broken thing in your life you are ready to sit down and repair? I will be reading every single one.